Greetings once again from Cooperstown, New York, site of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, and also site of today's virtual author series program, the latest in our continuing series of virtual programs from the home of baseball here in Cooperstown. Very glad to have with us author Dan Taylor. He'll be talking about his new book, which just came out in March of this year. It's called Lights, Camera, Fastball: How the Hollywood Stars Changed Baseball. Terrific book. I actually read the whole thing a couple of months ago, sent by some mutual friends of both Dan and myself, and we'll acknowledge those folks a bit later on in the program. Before we officially welcome Dan and begin our conversation, we do want to thank our primary sponsor, the Ford Motor Company. It's through their generous support that we're able to do programs like this and offer them free of charge to the fans and followers of the Baseball Hall of Fame. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bruce Marcus, and I work in the education department here at the Hall of Fame. And again, it is our virtual author series. Dan Taylor has written Lights, Camera, Fastball: How the Hollywood Stars Changed Baseball. We welcome Dan to the Hall of Fame channel, if you will. Dan, how are you?
I'm doing well, Bruce. It's a treat to be with you, and thanks everybody for joining today.
Well, we thank you for being with us. Just to give some background information on Dan, he's written some other books, a terrific biography of the legendary scout, George Genovese. Also wrote a book called The Rise of the Bulldogs. It's about the 2008 college baseball team at Fresno State. Dan is working in the Fresno area. They were the unlikely NCAA champions back in 2008. Also, Dan is an award-winning broadcaster and currently does play-by-play on television for the minor league Fresno Grizzlies, so certainly a diverse background. The book is terrific. It's a lot of fun. It's a great story that not a lot of people know about. And for those who might be interested in purchasing the book, we have a couple of links where you can do exactly that. Of course, you can go to the old standby, Amazon.com, and you'll find the book there. Also, the publisher is Roman and Littlefield. You can go to their website, www.roman.com, Lights, Camera, Fastball by Dan Taylor. And the book primarily deals with the incarnation of the Stars franchise that occurred from 1938 until 1957. There really were two incarnations of the Stars, and this book focuses on the second one, owned by a man named Bob Cobb, a very interesting character. And it was a team that had a very strong association with the Hollywood movie-making industry. Some interesting players and managers came through. Dan, we like to begin these programs by talking about motivations for writing a book. Tell us about what got you started on this subject. It's not a mainstream topic, although it's a fascinating one and a very entertaining one. But what got you interested in delving into this history of the Hollywood Stars?
Well, the genesis of this project was, so you originally mentioned, the legendary scout George Genovese. I was very, very fortunate to have been asked to collaborate with George on his autobiography, Scout's Report. And in becoming friends with George and the great number of hours we spent together, he spoke often and very fondly of the two seasons that he spent playing with the Hollywood Stars, 1949 and 1951. And whether we'd be at a game at Dodger Stadium or watching a game on television or just in conversation, there were times where George would point out something taking place either on the field or somewhere in the stadium or on TV and make mention that, that came from Hollywood, or we did that at Hollywood, or that started at Hollywood. And it really got the wheels turning, and mentioned a few of these items to people, and they had no idea that these things came from the Hollywood Stars. And so there was a part of me that thought, that Bob Cobb and the people who really were at the foundation of some of these ideas that did really change baseball had never gotten their due credit. And so that got me motivated. And then a second person, Artie Harris, who worked with George in the Dodger baseball operations department. And Artie, some of you may recognize him when I mentioned that he was one of the scouts in the movie Moneyball. But Artie grew up a mile or so from the Stars ballpark, Gilmore Field, and probably spent 100 days a year at really outside of Gilmore Field, trying to snag home run balls. But Artie was able to share just amazing stories bring invaluable context and perspective, and introduced me to a lot of terrific people that added to the storytelling and the information gathering. And of course, Stan Klein being one of them, the artist whose work is featured on the cover of the book. And Stan also grew up very, very close to Gilmore Field. So, and Artie's assistance and support and his tremendous gift of friendship are things I'm very grateful for. And those two men really were the guys that were at the forefront of this project.
Prior to reading the book, I have to admit, Dan, the only Bob Cobb that I was familiar with was the famous Seinfeld character, Bob Cobb, aka the Maestro. So I had to laugh a little bit when I first saw the name in print, but Bob Cobb was a real person, and that his full name obviously was Robert Cobb, but he went by Bob. He owned the famous Hollywood restaurant, the Brown Derby. That's where you begin the book. The first chapter pretty much takes place with the Brown Derby as the backdrop. And he was the guy who decided to become the principal owner of the new incarnation of the Hollywood Stars. Now, I know there's a long story behind it, but can you give us a quick synopsis of how Cobb came to be the majority owner of this new franchise?
Well, he loved sports. He was an avid outdoorsman, fishing and hunting, and was a competitive trap and skeet shooter, loved baseball. And his attorney had done some work for the guy who had brought the old San Francisco Missions and Mission Reds, whatever they were called at the time, down from San Francisco to Los Angeles, and in 1938 reincarnated them as the Hollywood Stars. And he subsequently had to file for bankruptcy. The team was in disarray, and Cobb's attorney managed to get a right of, an option for him, a right of first refusal to buy the ball club. And Bob Cobb jumped at it and recruited a lot of his friends in the motion picture industry. The Brown Derby restaurant, the one you're seeing pictured here, was the first Brown Derby. The second Brown Derby was the real famous one, the one at Vine near Hollywood. And all the studios were up and down the block. So the movie stars would come in there, and the directors and all and executives would come in there at lunchtime and at dinner. And so Cobb had a great relationship with them and recruited many of them to join the ownership team when they purchased the club in November of 1938.
Let's talk a little bit more, Dan, about the Brown Derby, because that was extremely important to the popular culture of Hollywood back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. I remember watching an old episode of I Love Lucy that was set at the Brown Derby, the episode with William Holden, where Lucy accidentally leads to him getting, I think, smashed in the face with a pie or a cake, something like that. It was a disastrous episode. And of course, Lucy was somehow at fault for it. That was the first reference I remember to the Brown Derby, but it was hugely important to Hollywood culture. Tell us more about this restaurant and what it meant.
Well, it was a mecca for the celebrities, and it really formed a lot of the philosophy that Cobb took to his ownership of the Hollywood Stars. He really understood celebrity. He understood what they wanted, that quality was important to them, that involvement was important to them. He put items on the menu that were favorites or came from the recipe books of movie stars. And he really catered to them. He wanted a top quality establishment. And one of the things that he preached was that if celebrities were not happy with something, were not happy with their meal or the quality of the restaurant, or they would never complain about it. They simply would not come back. And that was something that he took to his ownership of the ball club. But the Brown Derby's location, the Hollywood Brown Derby's location, right within short walking distance of the movie and the radio studios, it made the restaurant, along with his personality and everything that went into his management, his ownership and operation of the restaurant, it really made it a magnet for people in the industry. So it was a favorite gathering place of celebrities and executives in Hollywood. And in time, they did a great job of publicizing that. So it became a tourist stop. I mean, tourists would either try to get in to eat there, be able to see the celebrities around them, or they would gather outside on the sidewalk and attempt to get pictures and autographs. So it really became a part of the whole Hollywood legend, if you will, at that time.
My understanding, Dan, is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the original Brown Derby that's not in the picture here, the main room was this large circle or oval, and it was arranged such that no matter where you sat, no matter what table you were at, you could pretty much see everybody else that was dining. And that was done on purpose, right?
Absolutely right. Absolutely. One of the other things that he did was there were the gossip columnists, Hedda Hopper, for instance. They actually had reserved booths, and he gave them discount cards so that they would get a discount on their meal, because he knew that they would write about what they saw in the restaurant, who this movie star was with, who he brought in on a date or whatever. He had staff that their responsibilities. There was a sketch artist who initially started doing caricature sketches of the celebrities in exchange for a cup of coffee. And in time, Cobb came to really appreciate his work, and he lined the walls of the restaurant with those sketches. And he had people on staff who their responsibility was to stay on top of the gossip and keep those close together that were in a relationship or were couples. And if there was a breakup or a divorce, move their pictures apart. So yeah, it was set up in that way for that reason, and to foster that publicity and greater attention for the goings on of the Brown Derby.
So he knew all these Hollywood big shots, knew all the actors and actresses, or at least the A-listers, probably some of the B-listers too. And he kind of recruited among these actors and actresses potential shareholders for the franchise.
The building at the Brown Derby building at Hollywood and Vine was owned by Cecil B. DeMille. It had at one time been one of his studios. So Cecil B. DeMille was the first call that Cobb made when he was going to put his group together. And the package that he quickly assembled was that nobody could own more than one share. Profits would be plowed back into the park or back into the stadium. The monies they raised, were going to go to improve the ball club, because it was an awful ball club that he inherited. And then there were half the money was going to be set aside to pay for a portion of building a ballpark. So he just went right down his list of friends, and Bing Crosby, he was in. Barbara Stanwyck, she was in, and he just went right down this list. Gene Autry was one of the initial investors, and I believe it was about 22 that he recruited at $7,500 a piece, and he raised in the neighborhood of $200,000, and I believe $40,000 went to buy the club. $40,000 to $50,000 was set aside to buy ball players and improve it, and $100,000 was set aside to partner with Earl Gilmore in order to build Gilmore Field, their ballpark.
Speaking of Gilmore Field, here is a shot from the front row. Again, you see Bob Cobb on the left. To the right of him is his wife, an actress named Gail Patrick. Then you have, about to throw out the first pitch, Gracie Allen. And of course, she was part of the comedy team with her husband, George Burns. I believe he and Gracie had shares in the team as well.
Correct.
So this was really a who's who of Hollywood that not only attended the games, but they were active participants in the franchise.
Well, and George Allen and Gracie Allen, and George Burns, every night they were generally the first ones at the ballpark. They loved to sit in their box, watch batting practice. Gail Patrick, Cobb's first wife, she was considered the number one fan. I mean, there was always talk of in the various columns every baseball season of who's the biggest fan among the Hollywood celebrities, and it was always, they would talk about George Raft being one, they would talk of Bing Crosby being the other, and those who really knew and were out at the park and knew what was happening at the park, they said, no, you got to include Gail Patrick in that. She was a huge fan. And she, in later years, she did a post-game television show from her box next to the dugout. But one of the things you notice in the background, the way the boxes at Gilmore Field were constructed, you can see the backing there behind them. And that was done on purpose. Cobb was looking at how boxes were structured at the Hollywood Bowl, the entertainment complex, and also at Hollywood Park, the racetrack. And they had backing and in many cases sides. So the box holders had a bit of privacy. And that was really unique to ballparks at that time. This picture is from opening day, their second season of their ownership, 1940, which was also the day that the Hollywood Stars became the first minor league team and the first team outside of New York City to put a game on television. But George Burns and Gracie Allen were huge fans and rarely missed a game, and very involved in the ball club.
I think you mentioned that he sold 22 shares to these Hollywood folks. Pretty much all of them baseball fans?
Oh, absolutely. And there were directors, there were producers, there were performers, but huge baseball fans. And I had a wonderful conversation with family members of some of them, and they talked about, and I'm just blanking on a name here. I feel terrible. But they talked about how she was telling me how her parents never had any memorabilia from their acting careers, but they just had a trophy on the mantle that they got for being fans of the year at the Hollywood Stars games. They were huge fans. Gail Patrick later, she and her third husband, Cornwall Jackson, they would on Mondays were the universal off day in the Pacific Coast League. And it was the travel day. And when the Stars were home and were off, she and her husband would throw pool parties for the players and their families at her estate. And they would have a big barbecue, and she would write to them a few weeks out to save the date and just remind them to bring a towel, and they would have all the food. And so there was this great involvement. And some of the guys talked about actors inviting them out, Jimmy Stewart taking actors out, bringing them to their home in Beverly Hills for dinner, Bing Crosby taking ball players out golfing. I think that's what surprised a lot of the players when they joined the ball club, was to see that these celebrities were as big a stars of them as they were of the movie stars.
Yeah, there was a mutual fandom going on between the folks from Hollywood, the ball players, and the managers themselves. Here's a great piece of memorabilia from, I believe this is the second year of Cobb's ownership, 1939, and it coincides with the centennial celebration of baseball. We've seen this logo, that red, white, and blue centennial logo, on a lot of items that we have here at the Hall of Fame. And it was certainly something the Hollywood Stars incorporated into their ballpark, into their concession sales. This is an official program. So it's got the centennial logo, upper left-hand corner, red, white, and blue theme, and cost all of 10 cents. So I kind of feel like a connection between Cooperstown and the Hall of Fame, which started in 1939. And this incarnation of the Stars, they started in 38, but it's around the same time. So Cooperstown, the Stars, there's actually a link there.
Well, just to clarify, and you're absolutely right, this incarnation of the Stars began in 38, but Cobb's group purchased them, and their first season was 39.
39.
So the celebrity group was, in fact, 39. So this is from the first season of Cobb's celebrity group's ownership of the ball club. And I believe, if I remember right, they did wear that patch on their sleeves, just as they did another patch during the World War II years as well. They were always very in tune to, significant things going on in baseball, significant things going on in the country, and they incorporated that into what they were doing at Gilmore Field.
You mentioned Gilmore Field, and that was built in the late 1930s. The first incarnation of the franchise played at Wrigley Field, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Which was also the home of the Los Angeles Angels minor league team. But under Cobb's leadership, he wanted his own ballpark, his own identity for his own team, and he came up with this concept of Gilmore Field. It sounds like it was a fun and rollicking place to watch a game.
Absolutely. The first incarnation, that was Bill Lane's team that ultimately moved to San Diego and became the Padres. They shared Wrigley Field with the Angels, and they were just paying, basically covering their costs. And then there was a management change by the Wrigley family, and the new management of the Angels really jacked up the rent, and that's what caused Bill Lane to move his team out. So when Cobb came in, he knew that they had to be closer to Hollywood. They had to be in that area. They were right on the fringe of it in the Fairfax district of Los Angeles. And clearly they had to have their own ballpark. They didn't want to share Wrigley Field with the Angels. They wanted their own identity and their own ballpark. So this ballpark, it seated about 10,000. They did add some bleachers later, but they built it for $200,000, which is just shocking when you look at it today. Wow. But he wanted it to be very close. It was I mean, there were not many foul ball outs in this ballpark. And off the top of my head, I can't think of the dimensions now, but you were very close. I mean, Chuck Stevens, who played first base there for 7 seasons, shared that, he throughout games had a lot of conversations with the celebrities that were sitting on the first base side, that they were that close. I mean, he would open a game by warning them. He would say, "We got a new third baseman tonight. He's a little erratic. Watch yourself. Don't get mustard on you if a wild throw comes up in the stands." Catchers didn't have a lot of room back to the backstop, so they wanted that intimacy, and that's the way the park was constructed. They wanted later. They looked into ideas on how they could expand it, but it wasn't a viable option for them. But it was from all accounts, it was really a fun ballpark, a great ballpark to watch a game.
The fans were so close. There was such little foul territory. It sounded like it was almost dangerous to watch a game there.
Good question. I haven't picked up that from people through the years, but you can see they've got screens, so maybe they were ahead of the game there too, and I hadn't realized that. But they were tight quarters, very tight quarters. One of the things that Cobb was insistent on was he wanted the park built from wood, and it was a treated wood so that they wouldn't have fire issues. But he wanted the park built of wood because he had gone to Angel games at Wrigley Field, which was a concrete and steel park. And there were times of the year where that park, the concrete and the steel would amplify the chill and make fans uncomfortable. And he didn't want that at Gilmore. He wanted the fans to be comfortable and didn't want that problem. So he insisted that Gilmore be a wood ballpark, which in the later years became problematic. It wore and they had a lot of wear in it, and it became a problem. But it was a unique park, no question.
The ballpark officially opened May 2nd, 1939, so it was a little bit after the scheduled opening day. In general, how did the Stars draw? What were the fans like? Were they loud crowds? Were they more passive? Can you give an assessment of that?
Bruce, you know what they were like? Look at the Dodger fans historically. Late arriving, early departure. That predated the Dodgers. That's the way Hollywood Stars fans were. There were a lot of complaints over the years from management about, what can we do to keep fans late? Now, the big thing came in 1949 when they won, and that really changed the attitude and the mood at Gilmore Field. But early, they didn't win their first 10 years. They were a second division club. There was a lot of frustration over that, and that affected attendance. They did very well their first couple of seasons just on the phenomenon. And you mentioned that they opened in May. Right next door to this was Earl Gilmore's football stadium, Gilmore Stadium, the 20,000 seat oval, also an auto and motorcycle racetrack. And so they played their first home series in that stadium with some very unique ground rules because of the short distances to the outfield in some cases and long distances in others. It was once they started winning, and they had a tremendous stretch starting with that 49 season. Why, it was the crowds were great. They were enthusiastic crowds. They drew huge numbers, well over 500,000, many consecutive seasons, and then toward the end, with television growing and among other things, the crowds tapered off considerably.
There was obviously some Hollywood influence, as you see on the right side of your screen. I found this picture, and I couldn't find a caption. I believe it's Marilyn Monroe, but maybe it is Jane Mansfield. I'm not sure.
That one is Marilyn Monroe, and that was a celebrity game. Yeah, they would often have celebrity games in there as well, in addition to celebrities, regularly being in the ballpark. But one of the things that many minor league teams in the 50s had beauty pageants. It was not uncommon at all for minor league teams of all levels to have beauty pageants. But the difference for Hollywood was that the motion picture studios saw it as an opportunity to gain publicity for their new young starlets, and they would enter them in the Miss Hollywood Stars pageant. So in 1955, I believe it was, Miss Hollywood Stars happened to be a young up-and-coming actress, Jane Mansfield. But many of the Miss Hollywood Stars through the years were actresses who went on, none of them really gaining the fame and acclaim of Jane Mansfield, but many who performed in a number of motion pictures.
Now, do you know who that gentleman is at the microphone?
Well, I do not. I mean, my first inclination was to say Mark Scott, who was their longtime radio voice, but that does not look like Mark to me.
No. Yeah. Sorry to put you on the spot. I thought you might have known. Well, I'm sure somebody watching will be able to figure it out. I tried to decipher who it was, but could not determine who that MC was.
Yeah.
Now, the ballpark, it ended up, Dan, being demolished pretty quickly after the Hollywood Stars essentially went out of business in 1957. I think it was the following year the ballpark was demolished. So it was only around for 20 years. Any idea why it was destroyed so fast?
Well, Earl Gilmore's oil wells were drying up. And so he had really transitioned his business into a property development type of business. And so several years earlier, he had struck a deal with CBS. They were looking to build a new massive television complex, as television was growing. So the first parcel that CBS purchased was the parcel that his football stadium, Gilmore Stadium, was on. So that came down 51 or 52, if I remember. But that whole deal gave CBS an option on other parcels of Gilmore's land, one of which was Gilmore Field. So it was really predicated on the construction plans of CBS. In the season after the Stars were sold and left the area and moved to Salt Lake City, the LA Rams pro football team used Gilmore Field as a practice facility. I think they had a circus in there. So it was around, and some of the people were still kind of coming into the office doing some things. Although many of the Stars staff went to work for the Dodgers, actually. But yeah, it came down principally because of the construction plans and the timeline of those plans for CBS.
We talked about some of the Hollywood celebrities affiliated with the franchise. In one of the chapters of the book, you spend quite a bit of time talking about this power couple, Carole Lombard and Clark Gable. Clark Gable, one of Hollywood's leading men. Carole Lombard was a huge star as well, tragically died very young in a plane crash. Tell us a little bit about their involvement. What kind of baseball fans they were?
They were huge fans. They had seats front row, right at the backstop. They were there many, many nights. They were very avid diners at the Brown Derby. And there was a particular booth that it kind of became folklore that was the booth that they were engaged. Clark Gable popped the question to Carole Lombard in the Brown Derby. And so, people love to either get pictures of it or try to dine in that booth. But they were very avid baseball fans. Carole Lombard was a great baseball fan. And they were out at Gilmore Field very, very often. And what I found interesting was how involved the celebrities were with the team, not just ownership and buying tickets, but in activities of the team. For instance, one year when they had a bat day and were handing out bats to the kids as they came through the turnstiles, like Clark Gable and Gary Cooper and Bing Crosby and Barbara Stanwyck chipped in, volunteered, and were helping to pass out the bats. And I think if we ever get time travel, I think that's the day my wife wants to go back to and be a kid and get a bat. But from these amazing movie stars. But yeah, Gable and Lombard, Jimmy Stewart, Bing Crosby, they were there. Mickey Rooney, and Mickey Rooney took turns on the mic, doing bits of radio from time to time with the Stars, as did Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan there many, many a night. George Raft was there many nights. George Genovese would grumble to me that he'd be sitting up in the stands with this little betting group, and George would say he was betting against us. But yeah, they were very, very strong, very staunch fans, and there most every night.
Gable, obviously a legend in Hollywood. Lombard, though, is a huge star. I don't want to say she's forgotten today. Certainly people that follow the history of film, the history of Hollywood, they know the name, they know about her. But she's not as well known. Do you think it's primarily because she did die so young?
I was going to say, Bruce, I think that's really 100% it. She was a very, very gifted actress. She was very involved. She had been in Indiana, where she was from, doing a war bonds drive. signing autographs for those who purchased war bonds there in Indianapolis, and raised something like $2 million that afternoon. And her mother was with her, and as was her press agent. And the original plan was for them to come back to California by train, but she really wanted to get back to her husband and decided to fly. And it had certainly tragic consequences just outside Las Vegas when the plane slammed into a mountainside. Everybody aboard was killed. But and I think that's why she had done some very good work right before her passing, but she had some films lined up that others who were really became known as huge stars assumed those roles and actually donated their salary to causes that Carole Lombard was very staunchly in supportive of.
Okay, and another interesting photograph I found was this one. And again, there was very little information about it, but is that the actress who played Snow White?
Oh, good question. I've seen this and I haven't studied this picture in the past. Okay. I remember, and I know I've seen captions to it, and I cannot recall who the participants are. I'm not sure if that's, I'm not sure if that's, it's not Charlie Root, who was their manager in the 40s. Darn. Oh, I'm drawing a blank there, but that's a good question because she does look like the actress.
It's not Fred Haney, is it?
No, I don't believe that's Fred Haney.
Okay. So there were always lots of promotions. This was a great avenue for Hollywood and theater and television to promote things that were going on.
Well, you're right. You're right. And they would, like Abbott and Costello would come on the field and do their Who's on First routine, and various performers would come and sing Take Me Out to the Ball Game, and they would promote movies and allow the stars to give a little pitch on the PA mic before a game. They did some interesting work. The one promotion they had, which during World War II, the West Coast was under blackout rules. There were certain times at night that lights had to go out. Car headlamps had to be reduced in candle power, and so the Coast League teams had to play in the day, and it was disastrous for some. I mean, Sacramento was drawing 200 to 300 fans a game, and it really caused a severe economic problem for that ball club. And Hollywood, the last night game they held before the deadline, when everybody was going to have to adhere to the blackout policies, and the Coast League was going to have to go to all day games for a few years. But they painted their uniforms with a chemical substance that was supposed to glow in the dark. And so the team took the field. They had these uniforms painted, and then the plan was to switch off the lights, and the players would go through their pregame warm-up out on the field in these uniforms that were glowing. But the trouble was something went awry and they didn't glow. So that was one of their promotions that didn't work.
Yeah. Well, here's an innovation that did work, and they did a lot of very creative things. 1950, the Hollywood Stars introduced short pants for their players. Really the first time this had ever been done. Bill Veeck would try to replicate it without much success in 1976. So this was done by the Stars. They used the shorts quite a bit in 1950, and then it tapered off. But they actually continued the practice through till the end of the 1953 season. So I have to ask, did the players actually like the shorts?
No, they hated it. They hated it. The origin of it, there was a columnist in the Los Angeles Times late in the 1949 season who kind of challenged the Stars. And he said, with all of these incredibly talented people at the motion picture studios doing these wonderful costumes and things for movies, you'd think the Stars could tap into that and come up with something innovative in the way of a uniform. Yeah. And Fred Haney jumped on that. It was really Haney, more so than the front office, that really jumped on that. And the following spring, opening week of the season, Haney brought the team together in the clubhouse and had the clubhouse manager crack open the first box, and he unveiled these uniforms. And, the attention's all been on what visibly, jumps out at us, and that's the short pants. But the top was very unique too, because instead of the heavy flannel, that was a light T-shirt. And Sandy Oster was the bat boy on that team. Sandy shared with me that there was a lot of grumbling in the clubhouse when they showed off these new uniforms. And I asked Sandy who the most unhappy players were, and he said, well, it was the guys with the ugliest legs. But Chuck Stevens shared with me, he was one of the players, and he really was not happy with it. And Haney really quickly tried to sell it to these guys that this was going to make them faster on the bases in the field, that such a light uniform would help enhance their speed. And so the first game that they played, Bill Sweeney was the manager of Portland and had previously managed Hollywood. And Sweeney came out of the Portland dugout wearing a dress and carrying a poodle under one arm, with some pansies to give to Fred Haney at home plate when they exchanged the lineups. Well, the first hitter for Hollywood in the bottom of the first was Chuck Stevens, and Haney coached first base. And so first hitter for the Stars in the shorts, Stevens legs out an infield base hit. And as soon as he crossed first base and the umpire hollered safe, Haney turned toward the stands and raised his arms triumphantly and hollered to the crowd, "See, they work." But probably the most vocal and the angriest about that was Carlos Bernier. Carlos Bernier's game was speed, and Haney employed a running game. He liked to steal bases, liked to hit and run, liked to squeeze. I think in their 49 pennant winning year, they won 10 games on squeeze plays. So Haney really liked to play that running game. Well, as you can imagine, stealing bases and sliding into bases in short pants really does wonders for your legs. And Bernier was getting his legs pretty well torn up, sliding, and pleaded with Haney to ditch the shorts. And as you mentioned earlier, by, say, 51, 50, each year, 51, 52, 53, they use them less and less and less and ultimately phase them out. But, and I got to give credit, as you mentioned, Bill Veeck in the 70s introduced these with the White Sox. And there were a lot of fans who believe that Veeck is the guy that introduced short pants to baseball. But to Veeck's credit, Veeck always called the White Sox pants Hollywood pants. He always gave credit to the Stars.
Yeah. Now, that is Fred Haney on the left side.
It is.
I don't want to be too harsh, but he doesn't look great wearing the shorts. The guys on the right, though, they actually look like they're having fun with it. Maybe they just posed and put up a nice front for the camera. But as you said, they did not really like the short pants at all, and certainly sliding without sliding pads, very difficult situation. What about the fans? Did they like the shorts?
It was a big phenomenon, not just in Southern California, but up and down the Coast League. It was heavily promoted by ball clubs, and crowds increased when the Stars came to town. Fans really were keen to see it. There was an interesting rift that clubs had with the Seattle Rainiers at that time, because the Rainiers were not necessarily following the suggested cut of the gate to the visiting team. That wasn't mandated by the Coast League, but recommended by the Coast League. The percentage of the gate should go to the visiting team, and Seattle wasn't following that. So when the Stars got up there and they found out that the Rainiers management had heavily promoted the shorts, they chose not to use them. And the fans were really upset. And Haney said it was because the weather was cool, it was early in the season, and they were really only going to wear them when it was warm weather. But there was a lot of talk in the papers that this was Hollywood's way of sticking it to the Rainiers for not giving them the proper cut of the gate. Oakland was another one. It was right off the water. The park in Emeryville could get cool breezes at night. And there was a game early when Hollywood went in to play the Oaks, and the players took the field in the shorts. But after that half inning, they came back, and Chuck Stevens and others said, Skip, it's really cold out there. And he let him go back inside and change into the long pants. Fans were really upset about it.
Wow. Let's talk more about Fred Haney. He managed the Stars during their golden era. He had been a player, a successful broadcaster, but he was a guy in terms of on the field, really brought the Stars franchise to another level.
He did. He changed everything for the Stars. Their first 10 seasons, they were a second division club. Ownership was embarrassed about it. There were years where Cobb would enter the Brown Derby by the back door, so he wouldn't have to get heckled and teased by his friends and diners about the play of his ball club. And they went through managers constantly. Jimmy Dykes had managed the team 47-48, And the feeling was that he was too soft on the players, and really that he was just occupying a seat in the dugout until a major league opportunity came and he wasn't invested. I don't know how true that is. That was kind of the feeling about it. But Haney was very popular. He was a tremendously popular high school player in Southern California, as were his brothers. The field at their high school was named for the family, Fred and his brothers, for their athletic accomplishments. Played for the Detroit Tigers. Was really, to the end, one of the very few that remained close and loyal to Ty Cobb. Became the manager of the St. Louis Browns. Then after being fired, he returned home, and he had business interests in Los Angeles. And when he heard, during the war, that it appeared that Hollywood was and the LA Angels were not going to have the money and were not going to put their games on radio, he was really upset about it, because he felt all these wounded servicemen deserved the opportunity to be entertained by baseball on the radio. And he got with Bing Crosby and others, and they put in the money, and he became the broadcaster for initially both teams, the Angels and the Stars. Did their home games, and then they had another broadcaster who did the recreations when those teams were on the road. So Fred was very popular, and one of the promotions he created with the Stars was Fred Haney's Knothole game. And it was an opportunity for kids. They could come into the park on Sundays at a deeply discounted rates, and there were drawings, and there was the opportunity for a chosen member of the Knothole gang to be the bat boy the following Saturday's home game, and it had huge numbers of membership, and Haney was immensely popular. And when you think about the former player and manager being a play-by-play guy, Dick Enberg, the wonderful broadcaster, both network and for the Angels for many, many years, always said that some of the best advice he got as a broadcaster was advice that he received from Fred Haney, who was the general manager of the American League Angels at that time. So when Jimmy Dykes was fired and the board of the Stars was trying to determine where to go next, one of the board members, George Young, was very insistent that they had to make Fred Haney the manager. There was hesitancy about it, because Haney insisted he wanted full control of the roster. And that had been the business manager, Oscar Reichau's, responsibility. And Haney said he wouldn't do it without it, and he wanted a multi-year contract. And the Stars had always just given one-year contracts. Well, ultimately, they agreed. They hired him, and he very promptly went and arranged a meeting with Branch Rickey. And through that, he made Hollywood a Brooklyn Dodgers farm team. Bob Cobb was very reluctant, very hesitant about getting into a relationship with Branch Rickey. He had heard from others in baseball very negative stories about Rickey. There were people in the league who felt like when they had dealings with Rickey that things didn't go well for them. And so when they went back to Brooklyn and had a meeting, Rickey just laid it out for Cobb, said, "You can ask me anything." And Cobb fired away at him all the different things that he had heard, and Rickey explained everything to him, and then laid a blank sheet of paper and a pen on the tabletop and said, "You fill out what you want in this relationship, and we'll do it." And so when Haney told Rickey he didn't want Brooklyn sending older, broken down players to Hollywood. He wanted young players who were fast, who were athletic, and he had some really, really good young Brooklyn prospects. Irv Noren, who in '49 was the Coast League MVP, Mike Sandlock, who was their catcher, Art Shallock, Hank Sauer's brother, who was their right fielder. He got a number of very, very talented players from Brooklyn, and it really turned the franchise around. Jim Baxis, the third baseman, was probably the biggest surprise, because he was they really didn't think much of him initially in the organization, and then when they sent him to Hollywood, he had a breakout year, and so it helped them to win that '49 pennant. And for the next few seasons with Haney involved, he was fielding contending teams every year. And then when Branch Rickey switched over to the Pittsburgh Pirates, Hollywood followed suit. They broke their agreement with the Dodgers and became an affiliate of the Pirates. And then Branch Rickey hired Fred Haney to become the manager in Pittsburgh. And Bobby Bragan came into Hollywood and followed him.
Early on, the Stars had some veteran players who were at the tail end of their career. Babe Herman, we see him in the upper left-hand corner. But then, as you mentioned, Fred Haney wanted younger, better athletes. And that's actually Hall of Famer Bill Mazeroski in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. So they had players coming and going at various stages of their careers. When the Stars had Haney as their manager, I believe they were open classification. They were not AAA at that point. How good was the quality of play? I've heard this debated. Was it AAA, above AAA, almost as good as the major leagues? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the Coast League made several attempts to gain major league status. And ultimately, when Ford Frick became the commissioner of baseball, he laid out criteria. And stadium size and quality, market size, attendance over a 3 or 4 year period. There were a number of pieces that made up the criteria. And Hollywood fell short in the area of their ballparks. And one thing that they fought to change was the draft rule. If you had a player for 5 years, he became eligible for that minor league draft. And the Coast League's contention was they want to develop their own talent. All the clubs had affiliations with lower classification minor league clubs, and Hollywood had some great scouts. Rosie Gilhouse went on to be a legendary scout. He started with Hollywood among many others, and they were signing young players out of Southern California high schools. But the problem was they would ultimately lose them to big league clubs, and so they were the Coast League. That was one of their demands. Was either the money they get for these players has to be a lot higher, or we wanted to be out of that minor league draft so that we can develop our own prospects. And they felt strongly that if they had the ability to develop their own prospects, that they could be very competitive in the big leagues. I do, with the 16-team major league at that time, the Coast League, it was good. And to the people on the West Coast, that was their major league because there was no major league team west of St. Louis. So, yeah, they had the impression that it was big league, but there was a clear difference. I mean, people that when the Dodgers came west, they quickly understood there was a difference between the caliber of Coast League ball and Major League ball, but it was above AAA. And that open classification was Ford Frick's answer to their demand for Major League status. And they created a new status, an open status, which was above AAA but below Major League. And that was created for Hollywood. And kind of digressing a bit, but the pictures of Babe Herman, I contend that was the single biggest signing that the Hollywood Stars ever made. When Cobb bought the ball club, his manager had already left for the winter meetings and thought that he was still working for the previous owner and had no money to spend. And so he got to, I believe it was New Orleans side of the winter meetings, gets a cable from Cobb explaining things and telling him he's basically got $40,000, $50,000 to spend. And so the second player he bought was Babe Herman. The New York Giants had him under contract. He had played at Jersey City, I believe it was, in 38. But Babe Herman was an icon in Southern California. He was from the Pasadena area, from Glendale, huge sports star, came home every offseason, very involved in the community. And so to get him, Cobb understood the whole concept of star power that was big within Paramount Studios. And so getting Babe Herman brought instant credibility to his ball club. It brought that fan interest to his ball club. And this was not the really poor club of 1938. And Babe Herman was really a big box office get for the Hollywood Stars when they brought him in. Bill Mazeroski had 2 brief stints with Hollywood, an amazing player. You talk to people who watched him and they were mesmerized by his defensive skills around the bag. First year didn't do well and was farmed out quickly, but second year got off to a great start. And before the 4th of July, he was in the big leagues to stay, and that Hall of Fame career began.
One of the things that was remarkable about the Pacific Coast League, and especially with the Stars, was the intensity of the play. And that's why I included that photograph in the middle. I believe this triggered a brawl between the Stars and I think it was the LA Angels, their big rivals. These guys, they weren't going through the motions. This was serious hardball.
There are those, Ben Wade, one of them, who played in the big leagues and later played with Hollywood in the Coast League. there are those who contend that the rivalry between the Hollywood Stars and the LA Angels was far more fierce, far more ferocious than the major league rivalry between the Dodgers and Giants. And I think the animosity began when the Cobb group bought the Hollywood Stars. The previous group had used an office in the Angels' office tower at Wrigley Field. And when they hired Oscar Reichow, who had previously run the Angels, to run the Stars, they were promptly kicked out of that office. And a lot of columnists said, let the rivalry begin. And brawls were very common when these two teams would play. And of course, they had the legendary melee, 55 or 56, when during a doubleheader, Frankie Kelleher was their star player for Hollywood, big fan favorite, the only Hollywood player to have his number retired. And Kelleher was drilled in the back. And Kelleher was such a quiet, mild-mannered guy that his teammates nicknamed him Mousy. And Kelleher simply dropped, when he got drilled, he simply dropped his bat and very calmly walked to the mound. And as he got to the mound, he reared back and belted the pitcher in the chest and knocked him flying back in the air. And the guy landed on his keister. And by the time the pitcher landed on his keister, both dugouts had spilled onto the field, and a full-scale melee broke out. And they finally got that broken up. Kelleher was thrown out of the game. The pitcher was not, but Kelleher was thrown out of the game. And the pinch runner that came in for him promptly stole second and tried to steal third, but he went into third base, spikes high, and slashed up the Angels' third baseman. And the melee was on again. And this time it was worse. Well, the chief of police in Los Angeles had been at the beach with his wife, and he just happened to get home and turned on the television set. And the game was being televised. And his screen fills up with this image of this massive melee on the infield at Gilmore Field. And he immediately gets on the phone and orders the riot squad sent out to the ballpark to break it up. So they got things broken up. The doubleheader, first game of the doubleheader ends. The Stars go into their clubhouse, and Chuck Stevens shared the story with me. He was the first one in the clubhouse. He sees a guy in a suit standing in front of his locker with his back to him. And Chuck hollers at the clubhouse guy and says, "Hey, get this guy out of here." And that's when the man in the suit turned around and flashed his badge and announced that he was the sergeant on the riot squad for the Los Angeles Police Department, and told all the players to sit down, and then he was going to read the rules for the second game. Well, only 9 players were permitted to leave the clubhouse. Those were the 9 players who were in the game. And if a relief pitcher had to warm up, he and the catcher could leave to go into the bullpen. But otherwise, everybody had to remain in the clubhouse. Well, the second game of the doubleheader was completed without incident. But I think by the end of the day, the following day on Monday, the tickets for their upcoming series 2 weeks down the road in the Angels ballpark were pretty much all sold out.
Yeah, that's a terrific story. You mentioned something that's going to be kind of our last theme of our conversation, the broadcasting aspect. The Stars were very innovative in that they were one of the first professional franchises, minor league or major league, to have extensive television coverage. I believe it began in 1940. Later, this man became their play-by-play broadcaster, Mark Scott. The name and his face may be familiar to some of our fans because he would go on to serve as the one-year host of Home Run Derby. But Mark Scott was a huge part of the Hollywood Stars' history.
Indeed, he was. And broadcasting was a huge part of their history and another of the areas that they pioneered. As you mentioned, opening day, 1940, the second season of the Cobb Celebrity Ownership Group, and they televised their first game. And the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers had each televised a game the previous September at the end of the 39 season. And so Hollywood jumped on it. And on the West Coast, it was very different. It was still an experimental medium. And there were only 200 sets in Los Angeles in late March, early April of 1940. But it got this great response. There was a store 20 miles away in Long Beach where the store owner put a set in his window, and a huge crowd gathered to watch the Hollywood Stars game. and it spilled out into the streets, and the police had to come and break it up. So they really hit on they realized that they had something, and they did several more games that year. Now, when the war broke out, television's development was put on hiatus. But after the war, Hollywood was doing every one of their home games. And it created a lot of controversy in the Coast League because there was revenue sharing of the gate, and teams felt that Hollywood, by televising their games, it reduced the gate, and they weren't getting as big a cut. So there was a lot of animosity, but Bob Cobb's response was that he didn't believe that. He believed that so many people were moving into Southern California that it was important to showcase the product. And these 2.5 hours every night showing Hollywood Stars games on television would turn these new residents of Southern California into Hollywood Stars fans. Now, when Fred Haney moved into the manager's role, they were looking for a broadcaster, and Mark Scott he was originally from Illinois and had been doing minor league baseball in the East, and he pursued the job. He had actually been on vacation in Cuba with his family and heard the publisher of the Sporting News, or the editor of the Sporting News, paged in the hotel lobby. And he went and introduced himself to the man, told him that he had ambitions to grow in the industry. And the guy told him, hey, the Hollywood Stars are looking for somebody. Yeah. And ultimately he was asked to come out and had lunch with Bob Cobb and Bing Crosby in the Brown Derby. And at one point during their meal, Cobb and Crosby excused themselves. They wanted to go up to Cobb's office and listen to his tape. And Bing Crosby was the first to come out and winked at Mark Scott and said, "Don't worry, you're in, kid." Mm-hmm. And he became a huge part. He was a very popular guy. Fans really, really liked him. And as you said, he was in a few movies, parlayed that popularity into some movies and TV show opportunities, and then created what is just an iconic show, Home Run Derby.
Yeah, tragically, he died after that first and only season of Home Run Derby. He was only in his mid-40s, seemingly had a very long career ahead of him, but a very accomplished broadcaster. And Dan, just to bring things full circle, as you know, Mark Scott, the father of Mary Jane Dante. Mary Jane is a retired film editor who lives in Southern California. She is married to actor Michael Dante. Michael is a former minor league player. I met them a few years ago when they came to the Hall of Fame for a behind-the-scenes tour. And it was Mary Jane and Michael who first sent me this book because I had not heard of it. And that's what led to me eventually asking the Dantes, hey, can you get Dan Taylor to come on our Hall of Fame broadcast? So things come around in full circle. It's a small baseball world. And I think the Dantes kind of epitomize that. Great people, and they helped set this up for us.
Well, I'm very grateful. They've become great friends. I'm very appreciative. And I should add that the late Paul Pettit, who became good friends with, always liked to tell me that Michael wasn't just a minor league shortstop. He was a heck of a prospect in the Pirate organization. He thought he was a great player before he became injured. So got to give Michael that plug.
Went on to a very long career in Hollywood, did a lot of television, did some film work. The Dantes told me that the late, great Chuck Connors, Hollywood actor and former Brooklyn Dodger, was the one who introduced them. So a terrific story there. And by the way, Michael Dante just celebrated his 90th birthday. So we congratulate Michael on that as well. I know the Dantes are listening, and we certainly appreciate their contributions. The book is terrific. It is Lights, Camera, Fastball, How the Hollywood Stars Changed Baseball. We do highly encourage you to acquire the book. It's available at Amazon.com. You can go directly to the publisher, and that's www.roman.com, ROWMAN.com. Wonderfully entertaining book. If you like baseball and you like Hollywood, this is the book for you. Dan, this has been a lot of fun. You did a great job with the book and with the interview. We appreciate it. We hope the book sells thousands, if not millions, of copies.
Thank you, Bruce. I appreciate it. Thank you. This has been fun.
Again, we thank Dan Taylor for joining us here on the virtual author series, the book Lights, Camera, Fastball, How the Hollywood Stars Changed the Game of Baseball. And we thank the Ford Motor Company for being the sponsor. Without their generous support, we would not be able to do these programs free of charge. We do thank Ford Motor Company. We hope everybody's enjoyed the program today with Dan Taylor talking about the Hollywood stars. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.